for more. Let's cross to the United States. Pouya Alimagham is a historian of the Middle East at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the author of Contesting the Iranian Revolution, the Green Uprising. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
This execution, is it just a case of we don't care, or is it sending a specific message?
I think it's sending a few messages. I think given the precedent, we know that sometimes or oftentimes an execution that is not connected to protest is still timed to be connected to that time period of the protest, really to intimidate demonstrators and send a signal that this is a government that will stop at nothing to put down demonstrators, even though Mr. Akbari had nothing to do with the demonstrators. The timing of his execution is not really a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that his execution happened at the same moment where the government is still dealing or is still having to deal with these demonstrators. This happened again in 2009 when there were 2 people on death row before the uprising, the Green Uprising in 2009. And during the uprising, the government expedited their death sentences and timed the execution to happen right around the time where the government was trying to put down the demonstrators, really to send a message to protesters that the government is not afraid to put down demonstrators, even executing dissidents. We've had 4 executed already, and there are many, many more on death row as we speak.
But in this case, it's a British subject. Why does it matter so much that it's the UK?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. It matters a lot. There's a lot of history of, well, first of all, the government in Iran is very sensitive and very suspicious of Iranians coming from the West to Iran, in particular from the United States and the UK. When I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley, had a professor who went to Iran over the summer. I think it was 2003, and he was arrested and thrown in prison, in Evin prison. The government views us with incredible suspicion. The Iranian government is especially sensitive towards Iranians in Britain or the British in general, because there's a long history of the UK intervening in Iranian politics, in particular the UK and the American overthrow of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh's government in 1953. So it's incredibly even more suspicious. That is not to say that this person in particular is part of an interventionist policy of the British, but the Iranian government certainly seems to think so.
Are you surprised that there's been so far a deliberate response from the UK? Yes, we're calling the ambassador to Tehran, but now saying it wants to confer with its allies before making further moves.
I'm not surprised. I feel like instead of going towards the direction of diplomacy and reconciliation and negotiating over the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, things are incredibly polarized, and we're moving in opposite directions. And the sanctioning the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps as a terrorist organization is a political move designed to essentially further isolate the country, and that is exactly what the government doesn't want at this moment. The last time it was this isolated was when Iraq under Saddam Hussein invaded the country, and its isolation, its increased isolation, makes it feel vulnerable, and that's one thing a lot of governments have in terms of leverage to pressure the Iranian government.
Okay, Pouya, let me play devil's advocate here. Makes it feel vulnerable, but at the same time, if it's facing a strong internal dissent, it's an us versus them moment. That's good for the regime, right?
I mean, you can certainly say so, because war does get people united behind a government, or isolation, because then the government has an easier time presenting its domestic challengers as part of a Western or external conspiracy. But at the same time, the Iranian government wants to restore the JCPOA. It wants sanctions removed. It doesn't want that economic isolation. It wants an economic solution to the problems facing the country. It wants to create a better economic situation for its citizens, so they acquiesce to the political status quo, because it does not want a political solution. It doesn't really want to reform itself. It doesn't want to have a representative or a reform system. So in that sense, it wants an economic solution, and removing the sanctions, restoring the JCPOA is part of that strategy and objective. And its isolation is going in the opposite direction of the economic solution the government is seeking in Iran.
Putting the Revolutionary Guards on a terror list, same as the likes of Hezbollah, Is that the way it's going for countries like the UK and the European Union nations?
It's hard to predict. It seems that it is the direction that the UK is moving. It's going to be a little bit more complicated with the UK. I think Reza Sayed previously was spot on. The Iranian government will publicly shrug this. Privately is not happy about this. One of the things the Iranian government hates the most is bad PR and labeling its most, or what the state sees as its most venerated military force as a terrorist organization is incredibly bad PR. It's embarrassing. The government is very unhappy with it. And that also makes the restoring of the JCPOA more difficult because you can't remove sanctions on a country when you've also listed the IRGC as a terrorist organization because the IRGC is so heavily involved in the economy. So restoring the JCPOA while keeping the IRGC on the terror list really means that the sanctions are going to be even harder to remove. So in so many different aspects, the government is very unhappy about this, despite what it says publicly.
Pouya Alimagham, a personal question. What does this 4-month anniversary mean to you?
It means a lot of things. I think it means a lot of things to a lot of people. I think no one expected it to continue for this long. We have a lot of ebbs and flows, so it's still continuing. It's hard to say at what level, at what strength. Fridays we've seen uptick, but really what it means is that this protest has been going on for 4 months, and the government really hasn't done anything to address the issues raised by the protesters. It has doubled down on repression. So the grievances and the legitimate grievances of protesters endure. So I suspect that either the protests will continue or the government will succeed in repressing it, and there will be another spark that will reignite protesters because those grievances will continue to simmer underneath the surface.
Pouya Alimagham, many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you.